Since the Real Estate Commission rules changed, I keep hearing the same two statements. One, sellers no longer pay the buyer's agent, and on the other side of the coin, buyers now have to pay their agent out of pocket. And I have to tell you, neither statement tells the whole story. The buyer's agent commission did not disappear. What changed is where the compensation can be advertised and when it must be agreed upon, and how it is negotiated between the two parties. And as buyers and sellers are beginning to discover those negotiations, well, they can sometimes determine whether a transaction moves forward or if it falls apart. So today, I want to answer the question buyers and sellers they're still asking. Who pays the buyer's agent now? Hi, I'm Frank Spencer, Mr. Chatsworth, and for more than 3 decades, I've helped buyers and sellers navigate real estate transactions throughout the greater Southern California area. And since the rules governing buyer-seller agent compensation changed, I've found that many consumers, and frankly even some people within our own industry, still misunderstand what those changes actually mean. Some sellers believe they're just no longer allowed to pay a buyer's agent, and some buyers believe that they have to arrive at closing with thousands of additional dollars just to pay for their representation. Some people believe buyer's agent compensation is just simply gone away. It's been eliminated. And none of these statements is completely accurate. So let's separate the myths from the facts. The most visible change is that offers of compensation to a buyer's broker can no longer be advertised through the multiple listing service. Here in Southern California, those compensation fields were removed from the MLS. And that means that when a buyer's agent looks at a listing, there's no longer a field stating that the listing broker or seller is offering a particular percentage or dollar amount to the buyer's broker. But this is a distinction consumers need to understand. The offer was removed from the MLS, but the ability to negotiate compensation, it wasn't eliminated. A seller or listing broker may still agree to compensate the buyer's broker. That conversation simply takes place outside of the MLS and must be documented properly as part of the transaction, the contract. So, big question was the seller ever really required to pay? And the answer is no. Contrary to what many people believe, sellers were never legally required to pay a buyer's broker. Broker compensation has always been negotiable. And historically, the listing broker would often advertise an offer of cooperation and compensation through the MLS. If another broker brought a buyer and successfully completed the transaction, that broker would receive the advertised compensation. That customary arrangement became so common that many consumers began to think it was mandatory, but it was not. What changed is that compensation is now negotiated more directly and more visibly between the buyer and seller. The seller can still agree to pay some or all of the buyer's broker compensation, and that can happen in several ways. The seller may authorize the listing broker to compensate the buyer's broker outside of the MLS. The buyer may request that the seller pay the buyer's broker compensation as part of the purchase offer, or the parties may negotiate a seller concession that helps cover certain buyer transaction expenses. The precise paperwork and structure matter, and those details, well, they should be handled by the professionals involved. But the practical answer is straightforward. A seller is still allowed to pay a buyer's broker compensation. And in the transactions, that I'm seeing most sellers are, well, they're still agreeing to cover some or all of that compensation. The important difference is that the amount is now a negotiable term of the transaction. In most situations, a written buyer representation agreement has to be signed before an agent tours a property with the buyer, whether that tour is conducted in person or virtually. That agreement should explain what the services the agent is going to provide, how long the agreement lasts, and whether it's exclusive, the buyer obligation, and the amount or rate of compensation that the broker may receive. That compensation must be clear and it must be measurable. It might be a specific percentage or a flat dollar amount or an hourly rate or even zero. But it cannot say whatever the seller is willing to pay. And the broker may not receive more than the amount agreed to in writing with the buyer. Now here's the thing. This is an important point buyers just simply have to understand. The fact that a written agreement is required before an agent shows you a property does not mean that you must immediately sign a long-term exclusive agreement covering every property in Southern California. The length and scope of the agreement, they're negotiable. And if you already have a trusted working relationship with an agent, a broader agreement may make sense. But if you have never worked with that agent before and perhaps you called from a sign, clicked on an online advertisement, or simply asked someone to show you one property, I believe that agreement should initially be as short and as narrow and as specific as is reasonably possible. It might apply to only one specific property on one specific day, a limited number of showings, or a clearly defined geographic area. In other words, the agreement should reflect the relationship that actually exists at the moment. You should not feel pressured into signing a 3-month or 6-month exclusive agreement with someone you met 10 minutes ago simply because you want to see one house. Use that first interaction to determine if they actually listen to you, if they understand the market. You need to know if they explain things clearly, and do they seem more interested in representing you or simply getting you to sign on the dotted line. A buyer representation agreement is a contract. You need to read it. You need to understand the duration, understand whether it's exclusive, and understand how and under what conditions it can be canceled. Understand whether there's a carryover period after it ends, and understand exactly what you may owe if you purchase a property. If the relationship develops and both sides are comfortable, the agreement can always be expanded or extended later. It's much easier to broaden a good relationship than it is to escape from a bad one. Now, big question. Does the buyer have to pay or come out of pocket for their fees? Not necessarily. This is probably the biggest misunderstanding surrounding the new process. The buyer is responsible for the compensation described in the buyer agreement. But the source of that compensation, well, it can still be negotiated. The seller may pay all of it. The seller or listing broker may pay part of it. Or the buyer may ultimately be responsible for some or all of it. The written agreement establishes what the buyer's broker may be entitled to receive, and the purchase negotiation determines where that money comes from. So let's walk through 3 simplified examples. These are illustrations only, and actual forms, financing requirements, and transaction terms can vary, so take it for what it's worth. Suppose the buyer and buyer's broker agree that the broker will be paid a specific amount on a successful closing. The buyer submits an offer asking the seller to pay that amount, and the seller agrees. At closing, the buyer broker receives the agreed compensation from the seller or through an authorized listing side arrangement. The buyer doesn't pay that fee separately out of pocket. Example 2. Let's suppose the buyer agreement calls for a particular amount, but the seller agrees to pay only part of it. If the buyer still wants to proceed and the agreement has not been modified, the buyer may be responsible for the difference. The buyer and the buyer broker may also mutually agree in writing to modify their compensation arrangement. It's up to them. So, example 3, the buyer pays the fee. The seller may decline to contribute toward the buyer-broker compensation, and the buyer can still purchase the property, but the buyer may then need to pay the agreed compensation from the buyer's own funds. And that can be difficult, especially for first-time buyers who are already paying for a down payment, loan costs, inspections, an appraisal, moving expenses, and a myriad of other costs. This is why the compensation question can affect more than just the agents involved. It can affect the buyer's ability to even complete the purchase. Despite all the headlines suggesting that sellers no longer pay buyer agent compensation, I have to tell you most of the sellers in the transactions I'm seeing are still agreeing to cover some or all of the buyer broker fee. The biggest difference is that the amount is no longer displayed as a predetermined offer in the MLS. It's now a negotiable term in the transaction. And the buyer and the buyer's broker may have agreed to a particular fee. The buyer may then ask the seller to pay that amount as part of the purchase offer. The seller can accept the request, reject it, they can counteroffer, or evaluate alongside the price and every other term of the offer. So in this scenario, the seller still has a modicum of control. But control doesn't mean every counteroffer will produce the result the seller expects. We recently saw an example of this. I'm going to keep the parties and property private, but the lesson's important. The buyer submitted an offer that requested the seller pay compensation equal to 3% of the purchase price to the buyer's broker. The seller didn't reject the buyer agent compensation altogether. They countered at 2.5%. That wasn't an unreasonable response. The seller was exercising the very negotiation rights that these new rules were intended to make more transparent. But the buyer's representation agreement called for 3%. The buyer's agent was not willing to reduce the fee and accept 2.5% as payment in full. That left the buyer with a 0.5% shortfall. The buyer could have paid that difference out of pocket. The buyer and broker could have potentially modified their compensation agreement in writing, or the parties could have continued negotiating. But the buyer chose not to pay the difference and ultimately walked away from the purchase. That transaction unraveled. The lesson is not that the seller's counteroffer was wrong. In my mind, it was reasonable. The lesson is that a reasonable counteroffer can still have consequences. A seller may say, I'm willing to pay 2.5%, but I'm not willing to pay 3%. And that's the seller's right. But if the buyer doesn't have the money or is unwilling to cover the remaining amount, the buyer may walk. The seller then loses that buyer, the time invested in the negotiation, additional days on market, and possibly momentum surrounding the listing. The next buyer may offer less. The property may become harder to sell as its market time increases, or the seller may eventually agree to terms that are no better than the offer that was lost. None of that means that a seller should automatically agree to every buyer broker compensation request. It means that the seller needs to evaluate the request as part of the entire transaction. What's the purchase price? What's the seller estimated net? How strong is the financing? How much cash does the buyer have? What other concessions are being requested? And how likely is this buyer to close? And what might it cost the seller if this particular buyer walks away? The buyer agent fee is not merely an expense to be considered in isolation. It can also affect whether a transaction happens at all. Here's what a seller needs to consider. If I'm not required to pay the buyer's agent, why should I consider doing it? Legitimate question, I would say. My answer is that the seller should evaluate the buyer broker compensation as part of the entire offer, not an isolated expense. Suppose one buyer offers a higher price, but asks the seller to pay the broker's compensation. Another buyer offers less, but doesn't request that payment. The better offer is not automatically the one with the lower commission request. The seller should compare purchase price, requested buyer broker compensation, any other concessions, financing, down payment, contingencies, and the likelihood of closing, and the seller's estimated net proceeds. And the seller should remember that a negotiated reduction in a buyer agent compensation may save money on paper, but may still cost the transaction if the buyer can't cover the difference. So could refusing compensation reduce a buyer pool? Absolutely yes. That doesn't mean every seller should automatically agree to every request, but it means the seller should understand the possible consequences of refusing. Some buyers may have sufficient cash to pay their agent directly. Others may not. And for a first-time buyer or a buyer with limited funds, an additional obligation of several $1,000s could make a property financially unreachable. There's also an important lesson for buyers. Before you sign a buyer representation agreement, understand exactly what happens if the seller pays less than the amount you agreed to. Suppose your agreement calls for 3%. What happens if the seller agrees to pay only 2.5%? Are you able and willing to pay the difference? Would your broker consider modifying the fee? And would that additional cost affect your down payment, closing funds, or ability to purchase a home? Don't wait until you're emotionally committed to a property to ask these questions. Have that conversation at the beginning of your agency relationship. The buyer agreement determines what your broker may be entitled to receive, and the purchase offer determines what the seller may be willing to contribute. Any difference between those two numbers have to be addressed somehow. Buyers should not assume the seller will automatically pay their agent, and that possibility can be requested and negotiated, but it's not guaranteed. So who pays the buyer's agent now? Well, the honest answer is it depends on what the buyer agreed to, what the seller is willing to consider, and what the parties ultimately negotiate. The seller is not required to pay, and the seller is not prohibited from paying. The buyer does not automatically have to pay the entire amount out of pocket. And in the market I'm seeing, sellers are still frequently agreeing to cover the buyer broker compensation because doing so may help keep qualified buyers in the transaction. The commission did not disappear. It moved out of the MLS and into written agreements and direct negotiation. And because those negotiations can now determine whether a sale moves forward or falls apart, both buyers and sellers need to understand the consequences before signing anything. I'd like to hear from you. Were you under the impression that the sellers could no longer pay the buyer's agent? Or did you believe the buyers were now automatically responsible for the entire fee? Leave your question or experience in the comments because there's still a great deal of confusion surrounding these changes. And your question may become part of a future video. This video provides general educational information, and trust me, it's not intended as legal, tax, lending, or individualized real estate advice. Forms and obligations can vary, so buyers and sellers should review their specific agreements with the appropriate professionals. Now, if you found this helpful, I'm going to ask that you please like, subscribe, and ring the bell. And until next time, I'm Frank Spencer, Mr. Chatsworth, and I'll see you around the neighborhood.